He said, don't you remember the kids out there? They're out there. He had taken many children out there, and they were still out there playing. Would I like to go out and play with them? Mm-hmm. And I told him, no. I'd be a good boy.
I turned to look, and I saw Andy on a rock, and two people were holding him down. I couldn't see their faces, but he was crying and screaming.
While all this was going on, I could hear, a lot of noises in the woods, like somebody walking around, or sticks breaking, or a clicking noise. And it just seemed that there was somebody else up there.
I saw cameras, tripods and cameras all around the bed. And he had a dark room, a little closet that was straight across from the bedroom. I remember he had a red light in there. I didn't know what it was then, but if I look back now, I could tell it was a dark room.
And while being blindfolded, I perceived flashes of light, and I now believe that this was a gang rape photo shoot. Father Gallagher told me that if I behaved, I would be okay.
There were 5 known child molesters at the pool that day.
The police told you that?
Yeah, they were there. They said they weren't breaking any laws, so there was nothing they could do about it, but there was all those children laying prey.
He also said they sell children for child pornography, and once they get too old, they kill them. When I asked who they are, he responded, people who have sex slaves.
I knew that there was a big problem out there with Roman Catholic priests molesting children. I didn't understand the scale of it. I didn't understand the interconnection of how these people all knew each other.
Not only is there a community of these individuals, but there are actually groups. There are advocacy groups where these people join together, both to advocate fundamental changes in the law. They're groups that would argue that sex with children should not be criminalized, but that sexual contact is essentially an act of love.
They meet the criteria for RICO, racketeering influenced organized crime. They meet the criteria by transporting children across state lines for the means of sex. It's prostitution. They meet it. Why aren't the feds starting a grand jury and starting a RICO case on this stuff? There doesn't seem to be any consequences for the church, and I think that's the problem.
Back in 1998, when I first started working on Andy's case, I naively thought a child going missing in the 1970s was a rarity. We didn't have the internet then, or worldwide news. If it wasn't on the 3 or 4 channels we got on the TV, then we pretty much didn't know about it. Even local cases. If you didn't happen to be watching the news that night or weren't reading the paper, you would have no idea what was going on just a few towns over. Probably the first inkling I had that Andy's case was bigger than I realized was when I learned Andy's mom, Faith, said there were 5 known pedophiles at the pool the day Andy went missing. That made me wonder who the pedophiles actually were. That is where our journey into understanding connections between individuals and groups began. This is Open Investigation, a true crime podcast about the search for answers to the disappearance of my childhood friend, Andy Puglisi, and the incredible story of dozens of other missing children who disappeared or were found murdered around the same time Andy vanished, all while a hidden network of human trafficking was thriving in our community. I'm your host, Melanie Perkins McLaughlin. Please keep in mind this podcast deals with crimes against children, which may be triggering for some. Please take care. This is Episode 7, Connections. Act 1, First Inkling. In November of 1998, I was able to get access to a memo in Andy's file from 1989. The memo was from Lawrence Police Captain Joseph Fitzpatrick. It documented a conversation Fitzpatrick had with State Trooper Joe Flaherty, working as part of a special unit in Norfolk County. The memo indicated Flaherty said a prison inmate, Charles E. Pierce, was dying and wanted to confess to the murder of a Lawrence boy. The memo was followed up with a letter from Trooper Flaherty to Captain Fitzpatrick 6 days later, asking, once again, that someone from the Lawrence police come out and interrogate Pierce. As far as anyone can tell, they never did. In 1998, a Boston Globe reporter named Judith Gaines was following me as I worked on Andy's documentary for an 8-part series that was published in July of 1999. When I learned about Charles E. Pierce, I shared the information with Judy Gaines. She checked on Pierce's information through the Globe's clip files and discovered Pierce was a convicted child murderer. Charles Pierce was from Haverhill, Mass., 9 miles from Lawrence. Bordering cities Lawrence, Haverhill, Lowell, and Methuen are considered the Merrimack Valley. The Merrimack Valley is a bi-state region including cities in New Hampshire and Mass that border the Merrimack River. People and businesses in the cities and communities frequently overlap. Charles Pierce worked as a dishwasher at Captain Chris's Seafood in Haverhill, Mass., and at the Woolworth store on Essex Street in Lawrence, Mass. Andy Puglisi and his family frequented both establishments. Pierce also worked setting up tents and rides at the Topsfield Fair, which Andy and several children attended. Charles E. Pierce was convicted for the murder of Michelle Wilson, a 13-year-old Boxford girl whose remains were found near Baldpate Pond in 1969. Michelle was sexually assaulted and strangled. According to the prosecutor at the time, Robert Weiner, Michelle had been abducted while riding her bicycle, sexually assaulted, and strangled, then taken to a wooded area where Charles Pierce had sex with her body, beat her remains, then covered her with leaves and a 98-pound boulder, crushing Michelle's skull. Michelle's hat and one of her mittens was missing. Charles E. Pierce was arrested in Florida for assaulting a child in 1978. He confessed to the murder of Michelle Wilson and was extradited to Massachusetts. In the Boston Globe series, written by Judy Gaines and published in '99, Gaines describes one local police officer sharing a conversation he had with Charles Pierce in 1979. He asked Pierce where children he killed may be buried. Pierce only responded, quote, "There are so many," end quote. Pierce was still alive in 1998 when I learned the news that he was confessing to the murder of a Lawrence boy. I sent 2 letters to the prison asking for visitation. I received no response. Instead, I learned on the news that Charles Pierce had given a deathbed confession to a Massachusetts State Police detective and a Lawrence police captain. Shortly before he died, Pierce told the detectives that he murdered several children, including Janice Pocket, a 7-year-old girl who vanished from Tolland, Connecticut in 1973, and a 10 or 11-year-old Lawrence boy whom he would not name. Pierce said the Lawrence boy had olive-colored skin and wanted to go fishing. Pierce claimed to have killed the boy in his van, had sex with his body, and with the body of Janice Pocket, whose remains he had been carrying in the vehicle. Pierce said he buried the children in graves about 30 feet apart in a field in Lawrence, which he marked with pieces of coal. We found a former prison inmate who knew Charles Pierce. Here's how he described him.
I remember that when I first met him, I remember that he was just like the creepiest. He was a tall guy, he was a tall guy and very imposing. Nobody really messed with him because he was so big. They didn't mess with him like they would normally mess with some other child molester or rapist,
Do you think he did kill kids, or do you think he was full of crap?
I think he did. He had a coldness about him. I can't even put my finger on it because I've never seen it in a human being before. He was just like creepy as shit, and he had a presence about him.
So you think he did kill kids?
Yes, yeah, and just can't be made up about some of the stuff that he did or some of the stuff that he said.
The state and local police put together a team of cadaver search dogs to search the area where Pierce said he had buried the children in Lawrence, Massachusetts. They invited me to observe the search. We went to an empty lot off West Street in Lawrence, Mass., but the dogs didn't respond. You can join our Patreon as a subscriber or insider for exclusive access to video footage of that search initiated by Charles Pierce's confession. Another important point Charles Pierce shared before dying was that he knew Wayne W. Chapman, the main suspect in the abduction of Andy Puglisi. Pierce said he knew Wayne Chapman from seeing him in the area. The police reviewed Pierce and Chapman's time in prison. The only time it seemed they may have crossed paths in prison was in Bridgewater at the Massachusetts Treatment Center for the Sexually Dangerous. The Mass Treatment Center is a medium-security prison housing criminally sentenced male inmates identified as sex offenders and those who have been civilly committed as sexually dangerous persons. The treatment center was founded in the 1950s after 2 brothers, John and Paul Logan, ages 11 and 12, were found murdered in Brockton, Mass. A house key found under one of the boys' bodies led to their 21-year-old killer, Raymond Olson, a sex offender who had recently been released from a reform school where he had been held since the age of 15 for sexual offenses. The treatment center was created especially for repeat offenders. Another of the repeat offenders that was at the treatment center in the 1970s was a man with a simple name who would become notorious. David Brown was a Webster man sentenced in 1978 to the treatment center after he abducted 2 boys in Webster, Mass., assaulted them, and left them for dead. David Brown had begun his sexual offenses when he himself was just 7 years old. As a young adult, he impersonated a police officer to lure children. Brown would eventually change his name in prison to Nathaniel Barjona. In 1991, Wayne W. Chapman and Nathaniel Barjona, who according to author John Espy, who wrote several books on Nathaniel Barjona, were friends before they were incarcerated and hired the same 2 Christian psychiatrists, Dr. Richard Ober and Dr. Eric Schweitzer, to find them no longer sexually dangerous and get them released from the treatment center. In 1991, based on Ober and Schweitzer's recommendations, both men were found no longer sexually dangerous. Barjona was released into the community. Chapman was sent to the prison system to serve the remainder of his criminal sentence. All 3 men, Pierce, Chapman, and Barjona, had allegedly been associates before being sent to the treatment center. According to John Espy, the older Pierce acted as a mentor to Wayne W. Chapman and David Brown, aka Nathaniel Barjona. Espy writes, Pierce even told Barjona never to tell where the bodies are buried. Nathaniel Barjona and Wayne W. Chapman were sure to keep in touch after their release from the treatment center. The FBI have copies of correspondence between them, such as this letter, dated December 15, 1995, from Wayne W. Chapman to Nathaniel Barjona in Montana. Merry Christmas, Nathan. Thanks, Nathan, for answering my letter. I pray 1996 brings a top position at Hardee's with top pay. My hometown, Jamestown, New York, had 2 Hardee's in the 70s. I am waiting on a judge to respond to Rule 29. It's rumored that 300 men hijacked the Dallas County Jail, having offered the governor the opportunity to give all sex offenders statutory good time credits rather than to sue. Your friend, Wayne. On August 9, 1991, just a month after being released from Bridgewater, Barjona observed a 7-year-old boy sitting alone in a car outside of a post office in Oxford, Massachusetts. Barjona, who weighed 275 pounds at the time, entered the vehicle and sat on the boy's chest. Some witnesses, along with the boy's mother, observed the event and ran to the boy's rescue, causing Barjona to flee. An officer recognized Barjona's description from over 15 years earlier, and he was later arrested for the attack. At first, Barjona claimed that he entered the car to get out of the rain, but later admitted that he intended to kill the boy. For the attack, Barjona was given permission by the Worcester County District Attorney to enter a guilty plea to assault and battery in exchange for a 2-year probationary period and the promise that he would move to Great Falls, Montana, to live with his mother. The author, John Espy, a former forensic interviewer, spent several hours interrogating Barjona. Here's how he describes him.
Barjona was a big man, and he had very, very strong hands. He was able to use those hands in a very deadly way, to say the very least. He would sit on children, use his size to control them that way. After he got out of jail and he assaulted the little child in the post office parking lot, the mother came out and Barjona was in the back seat of her car, bouncing up and down on top of her child in the back seat, trying to smother the child that way.
My favorite part about that story is this mother opens the door and hauls this 350-pound pedophile off her child and drags him across the parking lot.
Well, he would, go to schools and watch children, and that was pretty much how he did it very early on. He would follow children home from school. He would discover what their routes were in terms of how they walked to school or if they rode their bicycle to school.
Both Wayne Chapman and Nathaniel Barjona impersonated police officers to lure children. They were at the treatment center when the North American Man-Boy Love Association was recruiting members. They both admitted to assaulting children in Webster, Mass. They were lifelong sex offenders, having started offending themselves before they were 10 years old. And as several law enforcement officers said, the treatment center became a sort of graduate school for sex offenders. Not long after Barjona moved to Montana, 10-year-old Zachary Ramsey went missing. In 2000, Barjona was charged with the abduction and sexual assault of Zach Ramsey, although he remains missing, as well as the abduction and assault of 4 other boys, one of whom Barjona had hanged from his ceiling upside down while torturing him. During his trial, a 36-year-old woman recognized Barjona as the man who had attempted to abduct her when she was a child in Connecticut in the 1970s. A second woman, after hearing the first woman's description of the vehicle used to abduct her, also recognized Barjona as the man who had attempted to abduct her in December of 1975 in Putnam, Connecticut. Here's her story.
I was 7. I was walking home from school, pulled up in a vehicle, told me my mother wanted for him to pick me up because she was working late. And I said, but I'm almost home. And he stopped his car and picked me up and put me in. I remember him telling me that the passenger's door didn't work and we had to go get milk and bread. We passed several local places that we would normally stop for milk and bread. And I always assumed that I had fallen asleep in the car. I spoke with a state trooper that was working with the case years later, and he said that his MO was to chloroform people. So that may have happened. I woke up in front of the Big Bunny supermarket in Sturbridge, Mass. Drove down a road somewhere in Sturbridge because he had to go make a phone call, an important phone call, and he'd be right back. As soon as he was out of sight, I went to the house nearby. No one was home. Hid under the pine trees, and then I saw a high school kid walking home. I told him what happened, and he took me to a house. They called the Sturbridge police, and that's really all that I remember happening.
The FBI got involved in Barjona's case in Montana. Barjona had coded writing that the FBI special agents worked on decoding. They decoded the name Zachary Ramsey, the word die, and recipes for little boys' stew. It seems Barjona was also a cannibal.
They opened the freezer and it was stuffed with meat, just stuffed with meat, and it was a wretched smell. Even though it was frozen, it was still generating a very wretched smell. And so they just took it and pitched it. They found bone fragments buried in the brothers' garage. Part of the problem was that DNA extraction in 1999, was significantly different than it is now. And so they weren't able to extract much from that. Barjona said very directly that he and Wayne Chapman had known each other prior to going into Bridgewater. Barjona said that they met in a park when they were both watching children, and that's how they first began to establish a relationship. Barjona also said that he, in essence, saw Wayne Chapman and Charles Pierce as, in essence, they were grooming him. They were teaching him, I guess, the finer aspects of being a more refined pedophile. Everything he did, every breath he took was in some way structured around how he could be a psychopathic pedophile. It just was. That was where his entire life's focus was. His facade of being a quote-unquote antique dealer specializing in toys, all of this was designed to lure children in and to molest them in some way or another, or to take advantage of somebody else in order to get access to their children. Charles Pierce said to him, one thing about you, fat boy, and that's what he said he called him, was fat boy, was that you don't know when to keep your mouth shut. And he said, the bottom line is that you never admit to anything. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. And that was pretty much Barjona's mantra after that. He never fully admitted anything. The detectives in Great Falls went back and interviewed Wayne Chapman. They spent about 2 hours with him. And they said that it was, quote unquote, a waste of time, other than that their impression was that he was just a supreme psychopath, and that they believed that Barjona had also been involved ultimately in the disappearance of Andy Puglisi.
Detectives mentioned, in addition to coded words, Barjona would use anagrams and similar sounding names to identify children. One of the names Barjona wrote was Alonzo Puggy, similar to Angelo Puglisi. Alonzo Puggy's name had 3 stars next to it. I later learned Andy's nickname was Puggy. His brother, Michael, shared that Andy had the name Puggy on his Little League jacket. When detectives sprayed Barjona's garage with a phosphorus chemical while investigating the Ramsey disappearance, the word TITA appeared, which led authorities to believe that he may have been responsible for the abduction of 15-year-old James Jimmy Teta. You may recall we talk about Jimmy Teta in Episode 2, Pandora's Box, and mention him again in Episode 3, The Other Boston Sex Scandal. Jimmy was from Revere, Massachusetts, and was last seen near Government Center in Boston. His remains were found in a wooded area in Rindge, New Hampshire. Jimmy had been sexually abused and strangled. Nathaniel Barjona was also named as a suspect in several other unsolved missing New England children's cases, including Janice Pocket of Tolland, Connecticut, who vanished in 1973, Kathleen Terry, a 12-year-old girl who vanished from a campground in Mashapog, Connecticut, and whose remains were found in Sturbridge, Mass. in 1974, just a year after Janice Pocket was kidnapped, and only 20 miles away from Tolland. Kathleen died from a crushed skull, and Andy Amato, a 4-year-old boy from Webster, Mass., who went missing in 1978. All of these children's cases remain unsolved.
The FBI that was investigating the case also believed that he may have been a far, far, far more prolific serial murderer of children than what anybody would have imagined. You know, just about everywhere Barjona lived, children went missing in one form or another.
If you or someone you know is a victim of child sex abuse, please reach out to the National Sex Abuse Hotline. It's available 24/7 for free. The number is 1-800-656-HOPE. That's 1-800-656-4673. Act 2. Missing and Murdered. As I've mentioned in previous episodes, several of the unsolved missing and murdered children's cases are similar. In previous episodes, we've mentioned Jimmy Teta and Lee Savoy of Revere, Mass., and David Lewison and Denise Cochran of Brockton, Mass., as well as Janice Pocket of Tolland, Connecticut, Kathleen Terry, recovered in Sturbridge, and Andy Puglisi, missing from Lawrence, Mass. The recovered children, Denise and Kathleen, had crushed skulls. Jimmy was strangled. David's cause of death is unknown because of the 6-year delay from the time he went missing until the time he was recovered. Here are a number of other cases from the list of cases we put together over the years of unsolved missing and murdered children from the 1970s. We note their similarities. These names are from a database we created, the first of its kind, that document unsolved cases of missing and murdered children in Massachusetts in the 1970s. Number 1, Michelle Wilson, 1969, age 13, Boxford, Mass. Crushed skull, Charles Pierce, convicted. Number 2, Robert Jankowski, 1972, age 3, Roslindale, Mass. Strangled, unresolved. Number 3, Daniel Croto, 1972, age 13, Springfield, Mass. Crushed skull, Father Richard Levine, named as suspect. Number 4, James Jimmy Teta, 1973, age 15, Revere, Mass. Recovered in Rindge, New Hampshire. Strangulation, unsolved. Number 5, Anne-Marie Grew, 1973, age 16, from Chelsea, Mass. Worked as a dancer in Revere, Mass. Stabbed. Jessica Moynihan, 1973, age 4, found in the woods in Rutland, Mass. with her mother, Maureen. Stabbed, unsolved. Henry Bedard, 1974, age 15, Swampscott, Mass. Crushed skull, unsolved. Michael O'Gorman, 1974, age 12, Gloucester, Mass. Found in 1979, crushed skull, unsolved. Lee Savoy, 1974, age 9, Revere, Mass. Missing, and unsolved. David Lewison, 1974, age 6, Brockton, Mass. Recovered 1980. Cause of death unknown, unsolved. Kathleen Terry, 1974, age 12, Sturbridge, Mass. Crushed skull, unsolved. Susan Rhonda Labby, 1974, age 17, Lawrence, Mass. Missing, unsolved. Kathleen Williams, 1974, age 16, Andover, Mass. Homicide, unsolved. Stephen Barnes, 1975, age 8, Dennis, Mass. Homicide, unsolved. Denise Cochran, 1975, age 10, Brockton, Mass. Recovered in 1976. Crushed skull, unsolved. John Leary, 1976, age 15, Jamaica Plain, Mass. Crushed skull, unsolved. Angelo Puglisi, 1976, age 10, Lawrence, Mass. Missing, unsolved. Thomas Willett, 1976, age 17, Jamaica Plain, Mass. Homicide, unsolved. Michael Cody, 1976, age 11, Revere, Mass. Alleged suicide. Gary McCormick, 1976, age 14, Lawrence, Mass. Alleged suicide. Nolita Del Val, 1976, age 9, Boston, Mass. Missing, unsolved. Carla Fowler, 1976, age 14, Salisbury, Mass. Crushed skull, unsolved. Deborah Ann Quimby, 1977, age 13, Townsend, Mass. Missing, unsolved. Judy Belfry, 1977, age 17, Boston, Mass. Homicide, unsolved. Simone Rittinger, 1977, age 17, Sherborne, Mass. Missing, unsolved. Andy Amato, 1978, age 4, Webster, Mass. Missing, unsolved. Teresa Corley, 1978, age 19, Bellingham, Mass. Strangled and sexually abused. Paula Kallenbach, 1979, age 15, Lynn, Mass. Crushed skull. Number 29, Richard Greenidge, 1979, age 14, Framingham, Mass. Crushed skull. That's 29 children that we know of who are missing or were found murdered in Massachusetts in the 1970s. All of whom, with the exceptions of Michelle Wilson and Danny Croto, have unresolved cases. 14 girls and 15 boys. 20 homicides, 9 missing. The average age of the children is 14. How do 27 children, and counting, as we continue to do the research, go missing or are found murdered in Massachusetts in the 1970s, and all of the cases remain unsolved? If you have information about Andy or any of the unsolved cases of missing or murdered children, please call 1-855-MA-SOLVE. That's 1-855-MA-SOLVE. That's the number for the Unresolved Case Unit for the Massachusetts State Police. You can always also contact the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. That number is 1-800-THE-LOST. Act 3, Coordinated Abuse and Child Pornography. In 1976, 2 weeks after Andy Puglisi disappeared, Wayne W. Chapman was arrested with a cache of child pornography, 8mm films, and Polaroids of naked children. One of his victims talked about the dark room in Chapman's apartment where he was developing photos. Chapman, a janitor, had expensive camera equipment and tripods. I believe he was producing child pornography for distribution. Today, those materials are more aptly named child sex abuse materials, or CSAM. Pornography suggests willing participants. Child sex abuse materials name what it is. For now, we're going to go with the 1970s lexicon. Several downtown bookstores in Lawrence, Massachusetts had been cited for selling child pornography. The man who worked at the 24-hour store where Andy and I bought candy just at the end of the street from where the pool was in Lawrence, Mass, was arrested for selling child pornography. He was fined $10,000 in 1976. The equivalent today is about $50,000. One Polaroid of a child was said to be worth between $50 and $200 in the 1970s. One of the last images Andy's mother Faith has of Andy is a Polaroid picture he shared with her just weeks before he went missing. When Faith asked where he had gotten the picture, Andy said a strange man had asked to take his picture and gave him one. Faith told Andy to never let anyone take his picture again. In 2016, 40 years after Andy vanished, I learned there were children, adolescents to be more precise, creating child pornography in the very projects where Andy and I lived. Here's the story from one of those victims.
The thing with the pictures is that there was someone in the neighborhood that lived there making us all pose as young kids. We had to pose in sexual positions. I'll never forget it. He was fascinated more with the young boys posing, and posing really disgusting too. I was 13. I believe he was a year older than me. I think it was always the summertime because he could get us downstairs. You know, walking home from the pool, he'd be outside and like, hey, come here, downstairs in his basement. And, you know, that type of thing and that. Yeah, there were Polaroids, yeah. Yeah, you remember that Polaroid camera?
Yeah.
Way back when, yeah, because you couldn't obviously, you know, do like a 38 millimeter or whatever, 35 millimeter. No, they were Polaroids. And I can still hear that sound. You know, you can hear it. And every time I hear that clicking sound, I know it's a picture being taken, and it just, you know, it makes my skin crawl. And like I said, I don't like my picture taken for anything. I hate it.
You never told your family about what happened in the basement?
Nope.
Never told anybody except the police?
Nope. It was a secret society, put it that way. We kept those secrets hidden. I told the police briefly. I mean, my boy, that was really hard for me to do, but I talked with them briefly, and then I just had to back off because to me, they didn't seem like they cared. I don't know, man. I just got a feeling that they didn't understand where I was coming from. He was young, and that's maybe the reason why the police didn't want to look into it, because they probably figured, well, he's a kid, but he wasn't just, if you knew him, he was the epitome of evil. And, you know, he's ruined people's lives. I'm going to tell you that right now. I mean, I used to have a really good friend, and he ruined his life. You know, having your picture taken and posing as a 13-year-old young person, it stays with you for the rest of your life.
There was another adolescent, a kid I also knew, who was taking pornographic pictures with his 5 siblings. I think there had to be an adult in the projects that was paying for these pictures. Could it have been Wayne Chapman? I don't know. We do know he had been to Lawrence more than once, in at least 1975 when he abducted the 2 boys he was charged with raping, and in 1976 when he was identified by at least 5 eyewitnesses as being at the pool the day Andy vanished. Could Chapman have taken Andy for child pornography? Remember, when I visited Father Tom Curran, he told me that these children are abducted for child pornography, and when they get too old, they kill them. When I asked who they were, Father Tom Curran of Lawrence, Massachusetts, smiled and said, you know, people who have sex slaves. We know from the affidavit in the Catholic priest Father Paul Shanley's file that the uncle of mine and Andy's friends, Father Tom Curran, lived in Lawrence and allegedly scouted boys to bring to Father Paul Shanley to rape and traffic them. Father Tom Curran told me that Andy is dead and would never be found unless someone happened to stumble upon his bones in the woods walking their dog. According to one of Father Paul Shanley's victims, he had a camera mounted in his ceiling over the bed. We were told from the corrupt social worker Dick Bavely's foster son that Father Paul Shanley and Dick Bavely worked together trafficking runaways and foster children to pedophiles. Bavely was closely associated with the millionaire Roger Spear, who was arrested in the 1977 Revere ring that ultimately formed the pedophile organization NAMBLA, the North American Man-Boy Love Association. And let's not forget the other 2 Massachusetts millionaires, Richard C. Jacobs and Hugh Scott Malore, who were part of the New Orleans sex ring in the 1970s. Based on our investigation, there are at least 15 credibly accused pedophile priests in the Merrimack Valley area. According to the incredible researchers at Bishop Accountability, there were hundreds of pedophile priests in the Boston area alone. Many of them shared children with each other, orchestrated and coordinated group child abuse, and took pictures. You can learn everything you want to know, including a comprehensive database of accused priests across the country and around the world at bishopaccountability.org. You may recall the 1975 Lawrence victim abducted by Wayne W. Chapman, who said he heard a second person in the woods and a clicking noise like a camera, and the Father Gallagher victim who so bravely shared the story of being raped in the rectory basement at St. Mary's while she could see flashes from a camera behind her blindfold. The 1977 Revere sex ring revealed individuals from all walks of life involved in the exploitation of children. During our research, we discovered credibly accused teachers, doctors, millionaires, bus drivers, priests, and parents. Were all of these pedophiles child killers? No. But as one law enforcement officer stated, there were child killers among them. Child pornography was already a billion-dollar industry in the 1970s, and it was unregulated until a large number of children went missing across the country during that one decade, and advocates pushed for congressional hearings and laws to prevent child exploitation. But no one has gone back to find out who these children were. As the Fessenden victim, John Sweeney, so eloquently said,
I'm telling you, and people think that I'm crazy, okay? When I tell them that they hit only one house in Revere, they only found out about the one house. At the same time, they were doing this stuff at Spears' house, okay? I told them all about Spears' house in Wellesley. And you know what's even more messed up? These guys, I'm convinced of this, right? That they have got so much power still in the media because nobody in the media wants to cover that story. I tried to get Spotlight to listen to that, right? I tried to get Spotlight to go back, okay? Because they said, tell me about the, Spear and all this other shit, So I told them, I says, listen, that place in Revere, okay, wasn't the half of it.
Next time on Open Investigation, join us for Episode 8, Advocacy and Call to Action. You've come this far listening to our series on the history of human trafficking of children in America and unsolved cases of missing and murdered children. Thank you. Please stay with us for this next episode. We will hear from survivors and advocates on what we can do to create change and to protect children from child sex abuse and support survivors, children, and families. If you find our investigation compelling, please consider joining our Patreon as a supporter, which helps us continue the work. This is an independent podcast, and we're doing our best to investigate and bring awareness to these unsolved cases. You can also help out by offering a rating or commenting on the show on Apple Podcast. This helps us get more listeners and may lead to more information. If you want to learn more about additional research on individual cases, check out our website and join us on Patreon. If you have a tip or any information on these unresolved cases, please contact the Mass State Police Unresolved Case Unit at 1-855-MA-SOLVE, SOLVE. If you want to reach out to me, you can email me at openinvestigationpod@gmail.com. This episode was produced, written, and hosted by me, Melanie Perkins McLaughlin. Editing by Mike Joshua. Original music and additional editing by Drew O'Doherty. Consulting producer, Angel Wood from Crimes of the Truest Kind. Graphics and website by Cheryl Crawford Design and Justin Strasberg. Research by Melissa Ellen and Maggie Schneider. Production assistance by Darren McFadden, Sarah Rumenap, and Alexandra Vega. Our social media producer is Carla DiStefano. And special thanks to George. You know who you are.